Wheat, the single most cultivated crop on the planet. By land area, more wheat is sown than any other grain on Earth. Annual global production passes 770 million metric tons, with 2 species doing nearly all the work. Triticum aestivum, called common or bread wheat, is what fills almost every Western loaf, while Triticum durum, a harder and higher protein species, is ground into the semolina that becomes pasta. Wheat was domesticated in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 years ago. The modern hexaploid genome, 6 sets of chromosomes inherited from 3 different wild grasses, descends from a single rare hybridization event no farmer planned. Bread wheat carries gluten-forming proteins called gliadin and glutenin, which give dough its stretch and trap fermentation gas to produce a leavened crumb. Hard red winter wheat from the American plains, especially Kansas, is the global benchmark for bread flour, and the United States produces roughly 50 million metric tons of wheat each year. Barley. Among the oldest cultivated grains in human history, Hordeum vulgara was being grown alongside wheat in the Fertile Crescent and was the primary staple of pre-classical Greece, Egypt, and Rome. Roman gladiators were nicknamed horderii, the barley eaters, because the grain was their training fuel, valued for the bulk it added to muscle. Today, barley's largest single use is fermentation. Roughly 9 out of 10 beers in the world are brewed from malted barley, and Scotch single malt whiskey is required by law to be made from 100% malted barley. 2-row barley, with larger and more uniform kernels, is preferred for premium brewing. 6-row goes to industrial-scale beer and animal feed. Barley also carries unusually high beta-glucan, a soluble fiber linked to lower cholesterol, and is one of the few grains that can ripen in the short growing seasons of Tibet and northern Russia. Rye. Sickle cereal is the cold climate grain. It ripens where wheat fails, on poor soil at high latitudes, which is why it became the staple of Russia, Scandinavia, and northern Germany. Pumpernickel, the dense black bread of Westphalia, is traditionally baked at low temperature for up to 24 hours, a slow caramelization that gives the loaf its near-black color and faintly sweet aroma. Rye contains less gluten than wheat, so rye bread relies on sourdough fermentation rather than yeast for both leavening and flavor. Wild lactobacillus cultures are essential. The grain is also the historical host for the ergot fungus, Claviceps purpurea, which produces alkaloids related to LSD. Mass ergot poisoning from contaminated rye flour has been linked to convulsive epidemics in medieval Europe and, by some historians, to the Salem witch trials of 1692. The Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann first synthesized LSD from rye ergot alkaloids in 1938. Oats. Avena sativa was once dismissed as fodder for horses by the English. Samuel Johnson's 18th-century dictionary defined oats as a grain that in England fed horses but in Scotland supported the people. The Highland tradition was driven by climate. Oats tolerate cool, wet ground where wheat refuses to ripen. And a daily bowl of porridge fed both farm laborers and prisoners through Britain's industrial centuries. Oats are uniquely high in beta-glucan, a soluble fiber whose ability to lower LDL cholesterol earned the FDA's first approved heart disease food claim in 1997. The Quaker Mill Company, registered in 1877, industrialized rolled oats production and made the Quaker Man one of the oldest registered food trademarks in the United States. Steel-cut oats are whole groats sliced into pieces. Rolled oats are steamed and pressed flat to cook faster. Instant oats are partly pre-cooked, which lets them finish in a microwave but flattens both texture and bite. Corn. Zea maize is the only major grain that originated in the Americas, domesticated in southern Mexico from a wild grass called teosinte around 9,000 years ago. The transformation is one of the most extreme in agricultural history. Teosinte's tiny 10-kernel ears bear no resemblance to the modern cob, which carries hundreds of kernels and cannot reproduce without human planting. Corn's most consequential cultural innovation is nixtamalization, soaking and cooking the grain in an alkaline solution of slaked lime or wood ash. The process releases bound niacin and frees amino acids the human body cannot otherwise extract. When corn spread to Europe and the American South without the nixtamalization step, populations relying on it as a staple suffered pellagra, the niacin deficiency disease that killed and disabled tens of thousands across the early 20th century South. Today, corn is the world's highest volume cereal by weight, with the United States alone producing more than 350 million metric tons each year. Millet, not one grain but a category, pearl, finger, foxtail, and proso millet are the 4 most cultivated, each from a different botanical genus. Pearl millet, Pennisetum glaucum, is the African staple, grown across the Sahel, where rainfall is too low for wheat or corn. Finger millet, Eleusine coricana, dominates in India and East Africa. Foxtail millet, Setari Bellaria italica was the original Chinese staple along the Yellow River, where archaeological evidence places its cultivation more than 8,000 years ago. Drought tolerance is millet's defining trait. Many varieties mature in 60 to 90 days on a fraction of the water wheat requires. About 1.25 billion people, mostly across Africa and Asia, depend on millet as a primary calorie source. The United Nations declared 2023 the International Year of Millets to push the grain back onto global plates. Sorghum. Sorghum bicolor is sometimes called the queen of African cereals. It is the fifth most produced grain on Earth, the staple of dryland sub-Saharan farms, and the base of regional beers like the South African umkumbathi. Sweet sorghum, a separate variety bred for high sugar stalks rather than starchy seed, was the alternative to maple in the American South during the 19th century. Boiled-down sorghum molasses is still a Tennessee and Kentucky tradition. The grain itself is round, pea-sized, and white to red-brown depending on cultivar. Sorghum tolerates heat and drought better than almost any other major grain, which is why it remains a strategic crop in arid regions where climate change is shrinking other yields. In the United States, most sorghum is grown for livestock feed and ethanol, with food-grade production a fraction of the total. Quinoa. Chenopodium quinoa is botanically not a grain at all. It belongs to the same family as spinach and beets, and the seeds we eat are dry fruits of a flowering plant rather than the kernels of a grass. The Inca called it Chisaya mama, meaning mother grain, and cultivated it across the Andean highlands at altitudes above 10,000 feet, where almost nothing else will produce calories. Quinoa is one of the few plant foods that contains all 9 essential amino acids in usable proportions, making it a complete protein. The seeds are coated in saponins, bitter natural detergents the plant produces to deter birds, which must be rinsed off before cooking. After the Spanish conquest, the colonial administration suppressed quinoa cultivation because of its association with indigenous religious ceremony, mandating wheat in its place. Quinoa stayed marginal until the 1970s, when it returned to international markets. Amaranth. Amaranthus, the genus that includes Caudatus, Cruentus, and Hypochondriacus, was sacred to the Aztecs, who mixed popped amaranth seeds with honey and, in temple ceremonies, with human blood to form ritual sculptures of their gods. After the Spanish conquest of Mexico, Hernán Cortés banned amaranth cultivation on penalty of mutilation. The crop nearly disappeared from Mexican agriculture for 4 centuries before its 20th century revival. Like quinoa, amaranth is a pseudo-cereal. The seeds come from a flowering plant, not a grass, and the grains pop into miniature popcorn-style puffs when toasted on a dry pan. The traditional Mexican sweet alegría, meaning joy, is popped amaranth pressed with honey or syrup into bars sold from market stalls. Amaranth is unusually high in lysine, an amino acid that wheat, oats, and corn lack. Teff. Eragrostis teff is the smallest grain in commercial cultivation. About 150 teff seeds weigh the same as a single wheat kernel. The crop is endemic to the Ethiopian highlands and is the foundation of injera, the spongy fermented sourdough flatbread that is eaten under, around, and as a utensil for almost every Ethiopian and Eritrean meal. Teff is unusually high in iron. Ethiopian women have notably low rates of iron deficiency anemia compared to global averages, an effect attributed in part to long-term teff consumption. The grain remained almost entirely confined to the Horn of Africa until the 2000s, when celiac-friendly diets elevated it from regional staple to global health food. Ethiopia briefly banned teff exports in 2006 to protect domestic supply as global demand began to climb. Fonio. Digitaria exilis is one of West Africa's oldest cultivated grains, with mentions in 14th century Andalusian agricultural texts. It also cooks faster than any other grain on Earth. A pot of fonio is ready in about 5 minutes. The grain is drought-resistant, ripens on poor soils where almost nothing else will yield, and is traditionally harvested during the so-called hungry season between staple crop cycles in Mali, Burkina Faso, Senegal, and Guinea. Fonio has a delicate couscous-like texture and a faintly nutty flavor. The Senegalese chef Pierre Thiam led a 2010s campaign that brought fonio onto American restaurant menus and onto Whole Foods shelves for the first time, framing the grain as a climate-resilient alternative to imported staples. Buckwheat, not wheat. Phagopyrum esculentum belongs to the rhubarb family, Polygonaceae, and the triangular pyramid-shaped seeds are pseudo-cereals from a flowering plant rather than a grass. The grain originated in the highlands of southwestern China and Tibet and spread along trade routes into Eastern Europe, where it became the basis of Russian and Polish kasha. Toasted buckwheat groats are served as a porridge or side dish. In Japan, buckwheat is ground into the dark flour that becomes soba noodles, and in the Brittany region of France, it is the only flour traditionally allowed for galettes bretonnes, the savory crepes that distinguish the region from the rest of French wheat bread culture. Buckwheat is high in rutin, a flavonoid linked to vascular health, and is one of the few common foods that contains a complete protein profile. Spelt. Triticum spelta is an ancient relative of modern bread wheat, cultivated in Central Europe for at least 9,000 years and championed in the 12th century by the German abbess Hildegard von Bingen, who declared it a near-universal cure. Spelt is a hulled wheat. The husk sticks tightly to the grain and must be removed before milling, which kept it impractical for industrial production once free-threshing modern wheat became dominant. The flour produces a slightly sweeter, nuttier loaf than common wheat, and some bakers report that the gluten matrix is more digestible. In Germany and Switzerland, the grain is sold as dinkel and is the foundation of widely available dinkelbrot. Spelt nearly vanished from European farms in the 20th century before the organic food movement of the 1970s pulled it back into bakeries and onto American shelves. Italian farro spezzato, cracked spelt, is the basis of Central Italian grain salads and rustic spelt soups. Einkorn, emmer, and farro, the three oldest domesticated wheats, trace back at least 10,000 years to the Fertile Crescent. Einkorn, Triticum monococcum, is the smallest of the three and the only grain in the wheat lineage with 2 sets of chromosomes. Modern bread wheat carries 6. Emmer, Triticum dicoccum, has 4. The Italian word farro covers all 3 loosely, though the grain in the protected Tuscan farro della Garfagnana is specifically emmer. Emmer was the bread grain of Roman legions and a dietary staple of ancient Egypt. Analyses of mummified remains regularly turn up emmer bran. The 5,300-year-old Tyrolean iceman known as Otzi had emmer in his last meal. Their lower protein content and looser gluten matrix produce breads that rise less aggressively than modern wheat and finish with a denser, chewier crumb. Wheat alone outweighs every other grain in human history, but 8 of the items on this list are not, strictly speaking, grains at all. Quinoa, amaranth, buckwheat, and the rest are seeds from flowering plants the cereal grasses leave alone. Different botany, identical role. Let us know in the comments which one we should go deep on next.